In the May 1875 edition of the St. Nicholas magazine, a peculiar little story appeared, transcribed by the writer just as it had been related to him by a girl from New England, who in turn had heard the tale from an older woman, and so on. According to the much-loved children's periodical, a very long time ago, an old childless woman had baked a gingerbread man who had jumped from her oven and gone on the run. Despite their best efforts to catch up with him, the old woman and her husband were unsuccessful in nabbing the salty little fellow, who taunted all who attempted to detain him in what I can only assume was a sickly sweet sing-song voice. "Run, run, as fast as you can! You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man!" After leading everyone a merry chase, the presumably half-baked little man ended up in the belly of a clever fox, and even as a child, I rather thought the sassy cookie ended up getting his well-deserved comeuppance, and barely felt a twinge of sadness for the rude gingerbread boy when the wily old fox made quick work of him. It's perhaps why I've never had a single issue eating gingerbread men. Or maybe it's just because the cookie with its crisp white icing and spicy bite is just too good not to eat. In our home, we've been creating soft, chewy ginger snaps and gingerbread men at the holidays since anyone can remember, selling them at farmers' markets, giving them as gifts, and just enjoying them ourselves. And no holiday season is really complete without at least one batch of the buttery, gingery, molasses and brown sugar sweetened cookies being decorated by the pixies in the little house. But we are certainly not unique in embracing gingerbread at Christmas time. All anyone need do is spend 30 seconds on Pinterest, Instagram, or in any store in December to find out that the world is a bit obsessed with gingerbread. And despite what aesthetic social media posts might convey, this is by no means a new love affair. This affection for gingerbread goes back to ancient Greece, where the first known recipe was jotted down in 2400 BC with one notable ingredient missing: the ginger. It was basically a honey cake and was used for ceremonial purposes, like their neighbors, the ancient Egyptians, who also had a version of gingerbread, but whose bakers, unlike the Greeks of old, ascribed to the common sense rule of incorporating the spice you've named your cake after into the actual mixture. At this point, the gingerbreads were made up of stale grated bread combined with honey and raw ginger. Apparently, this floated their boats just fine because the culinary masterpiece continued on down the historic record until, according to the rumor mill, in 992, an Armenian monk, Gregory of Nicopolis, left his namesake town and trotted across Europe until he reached the town of Pont-de-Bois, located in the modern-day northern France. Seeing the poor residents of the area were gingerbreadless, he immediately set down roots, spending the remaining 7 years of his life in a gingerbread ministry, teaching the Christians in the area to bake the delicious treat. Unfortunately, ginger was not native to France and had to be brought back from Asia proper if the people of Europe were to continue enjoying their favorite bread. Luckily for the cooks of Europe, around about the 11th century, groups of crusaders headed off on pilgrimages to the Middle East, and on their return, brought back all sorts of exotic spices with them for the aristocracy to use in their culinary experimentation. Once again, it should come as no surprise that by the 13th century, the Germans were madly baking up gingerbread, which they deemed pepper cakes, and working to create molds to shape the deliciously addictive treat, which they had named Lebkuchen, a crisp, typically heart-shaped gingerbread confection with a sweet icing message written at its center. In the Baltic region, which had been recently conquered by Catholic military order the Teutonic Knights, Baltic Germans got down to business refining gingerbread creations into an art, ultimately forming guilds to oversee its production. And then they looked up and realized there were folks going around without gingerbread in Europe. This would never do, so German immigrants with their skills and knowledge hit the road, spreading the goodness of gingerbread wherever they went until they ended up in Sweden. The Swedes, for their part, knew a good thing when they saw it, and in 1444, Swedish nuns in the Vadstena Abbey began cooking up gingerbread to ease stomach issues, which is a pretty good excuse to consume gingerbread as often as one needs to. Along with their gingerbread, the Germans brought with them a story about a house deep in the woods, made entirely of gingerbread, and decorated with candy that had enticed two abandoned children, Hansel and Gretel, landing them in the clutches of a conniving witch of a homeowner who had nefarious plans for the children. You'll be relieved to know she ends up with a hotfoot and the children somehow make off with all her riches. By this point, gingerbread was a celebrity, with medieval festivals and fairs dedicated to it, and vendors simply tying the gingerbread with a ribbon and selling it at their booths. Monasteries, pharmacies, and open-air markets across Europe sold the delicacy as both medicine and just for pure enjoyment. Jousting knights would receive bits of gingerbread as good luck favors before a tournament, while the Germans back in Nuremberg took a look at their strong gingerbread and thought, why don't we build a house with it, minus the old witch, and cover it all with candy? Back in England, Queen Elizabeth I directed her cooks to create gingerbread men in the likeness of visiting dignitaries and glaze them with white icing or cover the raised edges with gold leafing, which understandably charmed and delighted her guests. Previous gingerbread had been baked in the forms of animals, birds, and flowers and hearts even, but never people. William Shakespeare opined, had he but a penny in the world, thou shouldest have it to buy gingerbread in Love's Labour Lost. And once again, German settlers suddenly realized there was a shore somewhere in the world who hadn't tasted gingerbread and headed off to the Americas, bringing both their spicy cookies and their questionably dark fairy tale with them. The Grimm brothers set ink to paper to safeguard the German culture and oral folklore for posterity, fleshing out the traumatic details of Hansel and Gretel's childhood as the gingerbread men ran to every corner of Europe and the Americas. By the time the Marquis de Lafayette dropped in on George Washington's little mother, Mary Ball Washington, in her home in Fredericksburg, Virginia, she was ready for him, with her famous gingerbread, initially shaping it to reflect the king, and later, after the colonies had resoundingly kicked the royal to the curb and declared their liberty, as eagles. The rumor is her recipe has been faithfully passed down through the Washington family for generations. And while my own recipe is definitely not a secret passed down through generations of my family, I'd argue that my German blood has shown up in our current tradition of baking gingerbread man armies that present themselves tidily and deliciously at the Christmas season. And who knows, perhaps the Pixies and their taller siblings will continue the tradition in their own families, and the gingerbread men will run on. We hope you've enjoyed today's Advent video, and that if you have, you'll tap that like button, comment, and even share with your own friends and family, as all of it, as you know, helps our channel continue to grow. Now go mix up a batch of spicy little gingerbread men, and make sure you keep a good eye on your oven. I think you can guess which of Santa's lists they're on, and you've been warned. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you next time.